Again, I think you have bios in your binder, so I won't go into great detail about Robert Greenhill, just to say that he is the Chief Business Officer at the WEF, at the World Economic Forum. He started his career with McKinsey & Company. In 1995, he joined Bombardier, where he occupied a number of senior posts, including Vice President of Strategy, and he became the President and Chief Operating Officer of Bombardier International in 2000. He joined the International Development Research Center as a senior visiting executive in 2004, and in May 2005, he became the president of CETA, ex-CETA, as we now call it, at DFAT. And then Robert joined the WEF as Managing Director and Chief Business Officer in 2008. And I have to say, and I said this to Robert beforehand and to Roland as well, I can't think of a better person to kick this conference off, given not just your experience at the WEF, but your experience over the last 10, 15 years in international affairs and public policy. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Robert Greenhill. Robert.
Well, thank you very much, Vincent, and congratulations, Roland and Taylor, for organizing this and going from a book to what seems like it may become a movement. It's also great to be amongst so many friends and colleagues. C'est un grand plaisir d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. As a number of you know, this is the first time I will be commenting publicly on Canada's global context, and I'd like to make clear up front, these are my personal observations. They're not the views of the World Economic Forum. I guess from my perspective, I see a world of great possibility, great progress, but also extraordinary fragility, which is going to require new forms of clear-sighted, innovative, and integrative leadership, and where I believe Canada can play a very special role. Now, to start with, although it may seem surprising from the perspective of the West, this is a time of unparalleled prosperity, where more people are living better, longer lives than at any point in history. Almost 5 billion of the world's 7 billion live in countries that didn't experience a recession over the last 5 years. While per capita income in the Eurozone is 5% less than it was in 2008, in developing countries it's up a quarter. Over 3 million people are climbing out of extreme poverty every month, due in part, I would add, to great development assistance from the West. There are massive challenges, but also a tremendous opportunity. World Bank President Jim Comying's push for a world without extreme poverty by 2030 is not a pious statement. It's a projection of possibilities. A corollary of this global progress is that the economic dominance of the West is over. The Great Recession has accelerated an ongoing economic rebalancing of the world. Last year, for the first time in possibly 200 years, on a purchasing pricing parity basis, emerging and developing countries represented more than half of global GDP. On this measure, China is set to overtake the US as the world's largest economy by as early as next year. This year, 3 of the top 4 global economies are Asian. The G7 on a PPP basis has dropped from representing over half the world when it was formed in 1975-76 to barely a third by 2011. Similarly, globalization today is no longer a debate, it is a reality. The Great Recession confirmed the resilience of global flows, of trade and investment, but what is most striking is the broadening of globalization to every part of society. Civil society groups today are fully as globalized as corporations. Leading NGOs and social entrepreneurs are globally organized and financed. When global mining companies are now negotiating with indigenous communities in often remote areas, they find these communities are as globally connected as they are, leveraging advice from other indigenous communities from around the world. Similarly, while political democratization has experienced major setbacks, the globalization and democratization of knowledge is accelerating. The success of the global push for universal primary education over the last decade, the global availability of the internet, and the extraordinary expansion of mobile devices means that the population of the entire world is learning and communicating unlike any other time in history. Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter are enabling instant communications between millions of people without passing through governments or through traditional media. There's no disintermediation. Even where these particular products are blocked, such as in China, national microblogging systems are allowing citizens to share knowledge, views, and criticisms like never before. In line with this, there's been an extraordinary rise of non-state actors and creative partnerships. Joe Nye has said that one of the greatest trends of the 21st century is a diffusion of power from state to non-state actors. This reality is so self-evident that it needs little additional comment here, but I would like to note three, I think, positive developments over the last decade. First is the growing impact of foundations. Philanthropists like Bill Gates and Mike Bloomberg are having a transformative effect on development and other elements of progress on a global basis. They're making their money work as hard and creatively in the spending as in the making of it. Secondly is the increasing role of the world's best consulting companies focusing their immense capabilities on solving global issues. Dominic Barton, the Canadian Rhodes Scholar and global head of McKinsey, probably would have been in the public service a generation ago. Now, in his role, he's ensuring that one of McKinsey's priorities is to take its extraordinary talent and capability to help deal with key global issues. Thirdly, the rise of social entrepreneurs who are marrying social purpose with business to achieve remarkable results at global scales. So it is a world of great opportunity and progress, but it's also a world of extraordinary challenges. The corollary to this increased globalization, digitization, and innovation is the massive disruption of business, governance, and social models around the world. There is no business that is not being disrupted today. This disruptive age heralds the death of defense. Intellectual property, tariff barriers, privileged relationships, customer loyalty, none of these will protect a company from a better business model. In this world, mediocrity is fatal and complacency is a deadly sin. You either thrive or you simply don't survive. Staying still in this world is falling behind. This is not just true for companies, this is true for countries. The World Economic Forum does a competitiveness report every year, as you know. Mexico, for example, has improved across a number of indicators from 2008 to 2013. It significantly improved its absolute rating. But during this time, it fell from 52 to 55 because others were improving more quickly. That is the reality of today. Clearly, this is a world of great possibilities, but also of social costs, stresses, and I would argue, increasing systemic risk. I'd like to focus on a few of those challenges. There is today a crisis, a genuine crisis of employment and future employability in the West. Youth unemployment in Europe remains near record levels, and the unemployed there today risk becoming the unemployable of tomorrow. In the US, although the unemployment rate looks better, the participation rate, the portion of the adult population actually engaged in or looking for work, has fallen to under 63%, the lowest in 35 years. Together with a massive creation of value, there's been a massive concentration of value. In the US, the median wage hasn't moved in 2 decades, and wealth disparities have reached levels not seen since the Great Depression. And this is a global phenomenon, a global challenge. Indeed, global inequality consistently comes out as one of the top global risks in our World Economic Forum Annual Risk Survey. In addition to the social implications of the new global economic system, there are major geopolitical implications. As Roland was mentioning, the tectonic plates are shifting. The rise of China and India as global powers, and accommodating that peacefully, will be one of the greatest challenges of our time. Beyond that, as a derivative of innovation, one of the increasing sources of system risk comes from what I call frontier risks. Those are the risks by going boldly where no person has ever gone before. And that's just not the voyage of Star Trek. This is the reality in all sorts of different business areas today. We are engaging in innovations that test the technical, business, geographic, and governance boundaries. In many cases, the system implications are unknown and sometimes unknowable in advance, and they don't always work. The collapse of complex banking instruments in 2008, the disaster of Deepwater Horizon, the ongoing debates around genetically modified organisms, the challenges of understanding the long-term impacts of fracking are also all examples of dealing with frontier risk. Probably the greatest and most ubiquitous frontier risk we face is cyber and cybersecurity. It is a massive challenge because the system is so complex, so dynamic, so increasingly important, and no one is in charge. The cyber challenges at Target took out a CEO. The attempt against Saudi Aramco almost took out Saudi oil production. This is a huge and growing global challenge. However, the biggest challenge of all may not be that of a risk, but of a near certainty if we don't change our approach, and that's the challenge of sustainability. How do we avoid a potentially cataclysmic collision between the increasing aspirations of an increasing population and the decreasing ability of the globe to support it? This challenge, which is a stress of success, it's a challenge of prosperity, is being magnified by an increasing challenge of population. A few years ago, the conventional wisdom was that population would stabilize at about 9 billion, up from today's 7 billion, around 2050. The latest UN projections suggest that population will increase through 2100, reaching almost 11 billion by that point. Under certain projections, it may increase to as high as 16 billion. Under present policies and projections, the math simply does not work. Climate change is the most active debate, but some of the most critical issues are probably around regional water scarcity, the potential collapse of many global fish stocks, and the growing possibility of a future food crisis. There's a good reason why environmentalism is one of the bridging ideologies of the millennial generation, because it is a challenge that the present generation has not solved. So the world, as I said, has never been so prosperous. It's probably never been so challenged. The world's always faced major challenges. What is perhaps unprecedented is the simultaneous, interrelated, and global nature of so many challenges. So in a sense, the glass is 3/4 full, but it's in danger of shattering. What is particularly disconcerting in this context is the reduced ability of global governance systems to address and resolve these issues proactively. The G20 demonstrated an ability to handle the acute crisis of 2008. It has not yet demonstrated its ability to avoid future crises. Systems are trying to improve. Many UN agencies are better run and organized than in the past. However, the speed of improvements are being outpaced by the speed of change and challenge in the environment around them. Coupled with a reduced ability to resolve issues, arguably the world today has a reduced ability systemically to absorb future shocks. It's true the banking system has been strengthened. However, the debt situation in many Western countries is now the worst it has been in 50 years. Fiscal spare capacity to deal with future shocks is dangerously limited. Similarly, in the global supply system, physical spare capacity is very limited. In many areas, just-in-time systems and a belief in efficient global markets has led to a reduction of global inventories or safety stocks. In the quest for performance, many global supply chains and systems are built for cost and speed, not resilience. Our great collective challenge, therefore, is to identify, resolve, and untangle these complex issues before they become crises. How does one do that? This requires clear-sighted, innovative, and integrated 21st century leadership. Clear-sighted means being clear about where the world is, but where the world is going. As Mark Wiseman, the Canadian Pension Plan says, solving for the next quarter, but also preparing for the next quarter century. Clear-sighted also means being clear-sighted about one's own organizations, its shortcomings, its need to change, and being willing to acknowledge and address those shortcomings. Being innovative also means understanding the past, not being trapped by it. Willing to try, learn, and adapt. Not being afraid of failure, but not being blind to its lessons. Integrative leadership means understanding that the issues are too big, the need for speed is too great, and excellence is too dispersed to try to do everything oneself. It's working with others. A really interesting example of that is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs I, this 20th century Steve Jobs, who created the Macintosh, the Apple II, was an incredible visionary who tried really to do everything himself within his team, but also within his organization. And the Mac was extraordinary, but it was a closed system. And it couldn't compete against an inferior operating model because that inferior operating model had a better partnership model. Steve Jobs, too, when he came back after his time at Pixar, actually was just as innovative, just as determined a leader, but he was a much more integrative leader than the 20th century version in terms of how he worked with his team, but also how he worked with others. The iPhone has almost no manufacturing by Apple. In fact, there's more components that are manufactured by its key competitor, Samsung, than by itself. The 21st century Steve Jobs understood that true visionary leadership is integrative leadership. What does this mean for Canada? Canada is only 2 to 3% of global GDP and about 0.5% of global population. But I believe in this world we can have an influence well beyond that if we are smart and strategic. Canada today has a strategic flexibility distinct from other G7 and BRIC countries. We will soon have a balanced budget. We do not have major regional or neighborhood disputes. We have a healthy domestic and constitutional situation. I believe our credibility and capability are particularly effective under two scenarios, that of pivotal interventions and that of shaping strategies. Pivotal interventions involve engaging on critical issues in a positive way when others are exhausted, discredited, or have cancelled one another out. In World War II, Canada's strong engagement played a pivotal role from the fall of France to the entrance of the United States into the war a year and a half later. Canada played a pivotal role in 1956 in resolving the Suez Crisis. We played a pivotal, if unsung, role in 1996 with Huguette Labelle working with President Kagame to focus his efforts on development and not on retribution in a blood-soaked Rwanda. There have been three recent examples of pivotal interventions that I would look to. One is in Afghanistan from 2006 and the resurgence of the Taliban to Obama's surge in 2009. I believe Canada played a key role in holding the line against the resurgent Taliban, particularly in Kandahar. Every year in Afghanistan, 50,000 more children live that would have died under the high mortality rate of the Taliban because of the West's engagement. We played a pivotal role in that. Secondly, arguably the free trade agreement with Colombia. It's a case where there was bipartisan agreement to put in place a free trade agreement with human rights elements that not unlocked the trade with Canada and Colombia, but also helped provide a context where the free trade agreement between the United States and Colombia was ratified as well. Colombia is going through a very challenging time, but it's probably the most hopeful time in its last 30 years. And opening borders, trying to open debate and discussion is an area where Canada also made, I think, a pivotal contribution. Finally, during the global financial crisis, I believe Canada played a pivotal role. We played a pivotal role through our policies and our stabilizing influence. We also played a pivotal role through our people. I think the combination of Minister Flaherty, of Mark Carney, and key officials in finance, such as Paul Rochon, actually made a real contribution. Finance Minister Flaherty was selected Finance Minister of the Year in 2009 for a good reason. Mark was trusted to lead the Financial Stability Board and then exported to UK for a good reason. When I talked to key IMF officials and they praised Paul Rochon and other finance officials and their role at that time and since, it's again for a good reason. It's because we provided not only policies, we provided people to help the world stick together when it was in danger of falling apart. Those are examples of pivotal interventions. I also think Canada has an opportunity at a more strategic level to play a role in shaping strategies, acting as clear-sighted, innovative, and integrating leaders to address key global issues. I think we're actually doing that today with maternal, newborn, and child health. This is a great positive sum opportunity. I was at the Global Health Assembly earlier this week before coming here, and people are genuinely excited about the leadership role Canada is playing. It's an example of us building on an area of historical credibility and real capability. It is triggered by smart advice from Margaret Biggs and then CETA. It was supported by genuine political leadership at a sustained level from the Prime Minister on down. And the Prime Minister's personal engagement in this cannot be underestimated. It's involved real multi-stakeholder engagement, whether it's been key NGOs in Canada and abroad, whether it's been tech working with a micronutrient initiative for zinc fortification, or whether it's been Peter Singer's and the very innovative Global Challenges program. So Canada hasn't just contributed money here, it's contributed ideas. It's truly provided innovative, integrative leadership. Shaping agendas requires focusing on those few areas where we are credible, capable, and committed for the long term. Many of the speakers will focus on this with much greater knowledge than me over the next few days, but whether it be on Arctic, whether it be on responsible mineral development, whether it be in accelerating the reform of global institutions, we can play a critical role. Let me leave with three final thoughts. One is, if we want to be positive, we should be prepared to challenge and change the status quo. The status quo in international governance is not working today and is not sustainable in the future. Believing in the principles of the United Nations means we should not tolerate practices that are no longer effective. We should improve them. Secondly, we should be hopeful and determined. There's very little that can be done individually in this crowded world. There's very little that cannot be done collectively. This is an exciting time. and unprecedented change and progress is possible. Thirdly, Canadians are particularly well-suited to dealing with this complex, confusing world of today. Our country was built on the recognition that no group can impose its views on others. John A. Macdonald and Georges-Étienne Cartier were innovative, integrating leaders, bringing together various often competing groups to create something truly new and exciting. Throughout our history, we have had to innovate and had to collaborate. Canada is designed for the challenges of the 21st century. Aga Khan chose Canada for its global center of pluralism for a reason. To paraphrase Laurier, Canada belongs to the 21st century. I thank you for your time.
Testing. Indeed, it does work. Okay, well, thank you very much, Robert. And as I predicted, you did an absolutely fabulous job of covering a diverse range of subjects and really elucidating what you clearly described to be a complex world. Some interesting quotes that fell out that might shape the discussion over the next 20 minutes or so. But that the world is a three-quarters glass full, but in danger of shattering in terms of the environment. Staying still is falling behind. The need for integrative leadership, and Canada's special assets in terms of actually engaging in what you call pivotal interventions and shaping strategies, and that, in fact, Canada has a lot of potential here to make a really significant difference. So there's a lot for us to dig our teeth into, whether we want to talk about some of the trends that Robert discussed, or to talk about how Canada can respond to those trends. I was told that I could ask the first question if I absolutely wanted to, but I have so many questions that I think best just maybe to throw it out to the audience, and maybe just a couple of ground rules. There is, I think, a microphone that's going to be flowing around. Please keep your interventions very short and direct. Questions, please, and or comments to be responded to by Robert. And also just identify yourself, your affiliation, your name, etc. So we could start right here with the first hand up.
Good morning. My name is Paul Dewar, Member of Parliament. Wanted to ask you, I appreciated the overview you gave us and quite liked the language.
I'm sorry, could you stand up, Mr. Dewar, please? Yes. I do apologize.
I'm shy. So you gave us this theme of integrated leadership. I quite like that. Where do we go with it in the next steps? Maternal health's great. Let's finish that. And that's something I would argue we also have to pay attention to. On my plate as a foreign affairs critic, I'm looking at things like South Sudan, at CAR, the whole region, which some would say right now we've kind of turned away from. So I agree with you, this notion of doing what we can, being pivotal, as well as being leaders at the same time. Where do we go, though, beyond some of the things you laid out? What do you see as the next place where we can take leadership in the way you've described, as well as finishing what we've already started? Because I think that's a challenge for many governments. And when I think of our role in the world, sometimes we forget what we've done well, and we can innovate that as well, as opposed to just turning away from that and going on to something brand new. Like your approach, just wondering, what do you see as the next thing, the next issue or region that we can play a role in the way you described?
So let me answer that in two ways. One is, I think there are a number of issues, and I think the speakers who come will probably elucidate them better than I. A couple that come out very clearly in conversations with people around the Arctic. The effective shared governance of the Arctic, not only because it's important for the Arctic, but if it can be an example of the application of the law of the seas, that when people are looking at debates in the China seas, it could be used as a positive model. There's an opportunity, a challenging one, particularly with the situation with Russia right now, but there is a huge opportunity and a strategic need for us to get that right. The whole issue around responsible mineral development, where there have been a lot of different elements by the private sector, by the government, by NGOs to do this, but we could do it in a much more coordinated and forceful to say, what is truly responsible mineral development look like in the 21st century, and how do we ensure we are consistently best class in that as Canadians? A third area, I think, is around this issue of reform of international institutions. I mean, I think we have the credibility to provide the tough love that is necessary to really make a difference there. I guess my point, too, would be integrative leadership isn't just externally, it's also domestically. It's how do we actually ensure that if we're so good at uniting different groups internationally that we can also do the same domestically? How do we get the different institutions, the private sector, civil society working together? And how do we identify areas of cooperation that transcend partisan differences? One of the interesting elements of Afghanistan, in my mind, was the Manley Commission. Challenging, controversial, but I think very powerful to try to determine what's a whole of Canada perspective on these critical issues.
I'm glad you mentioned the Arctic because that's a file very dear to my heart right now. And of course, Canada is the chair of the Arctic Council, so we've got a wonderful opportunity to play a leadership role at the moment. Another comment or question, please. In the front row, right here, please.
Hi, I'm Andrea Mandel-Campbell. I'm one of the presenters today. I was intrigued by one of your last comments about the status quo and in particular in reference to the United Nations. I'm just curious because there's kind of this ongoing debate. The current government gets a lot of criticism for kind of taking a pretty strong stand on a lot of issues and openly criticizing the United Nations. At the same time, they get criticized here in Canada, and there seems to be this desire to harken back to our original traditions, the Pearsonian tradition. So I'm curious how you reconcile that.
So I'm not going to comment on the specific policies of a specific government. But I would note that Pearson did not spend all his time in the 1940s trying to recreate the League of Nations, right? He focused his time on creating the institutions, continuing the institutions from the League of Nations that were still relevant today, but in other cases, crafting new institutions or new approaches that were relevant to the needs of that time and the time to come.
Other comments or questions, please? Don't be shy. There we go.
Yes, good morning. My name is Jean-Pierre Chabot. I'm with the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. And not to put a negative bend on the morning session, but actually the work that we do, I know that the WEF has a partnering organization for anti-corruption partnership program. Looking at it from a opportunity cost perspective, actually reducing corruption could actually be an impetus for increasing development. What are your views on looking at corruption as an opportunity as opposed to merely a threat or a challenge?
I'm really glad you raised it because I think it's an extraordinary need and an extraordinary opportunity. In fact, one of the other elements where Canada can make a real difference is on this issue of enhancing integrity and rules-based, sort of the rule of law internationally. I believe we may be at a tipping point globally on the issue against corruption. So my team leads the Partnership Against Corruption. I've been very involved through the B20 and G20 on this over the last 4 years. And the fact is that if you look at surveys around the world, nobody believes corruption is tolerable. This idea that there's social differences and so on, I think is increasingly nonsense. And in fact, the economic and social and security costs of corruption, I think, are increasingly intolerable. And what is good with the UNCAC and the G20 and the OECD work on this is for public officials and for corporations, the cost of engaging in corruption is getting increasingly high. And I actually believe there's a real challenge and opportunity in many areas to actually design out corruption as an endemic feature. I think it's very good we've started at home. I think we passed long overdue legislation to deal with the territoriality elements of corruption in our own legislation. And what I think is happening in Quebec right now is actually showing a level of honesty and engagement, which the rest of Canada should applaud and in some case should actually look to copy.
I saw a hand at the back, and I think I recognized that face.
Mr. Falco.
Thank you, Robert, for your comments. I'm going to leave aside the brilliant successes of Afghanistan and the world-changing Colombian trade deal.
Just introduce yourself for everybody, for those who...
Bob Fowler.
I know who it is, but I just want to make sure everyone else does.
I'm also not going to talk about changing mother and child health without touching birth control or reproductive health. Instead, I'm going to talk about changing the multilateral system. The multilateral system essentially was built on 51 countries in 1945, dominated by rich guys. you say we've got to change the system to better reflect some kind of reality. Maybe it's a Davos reality, I'm not sure. Do you think that any new multilateral reality is going to better favor poor countries and the massive world population, or is it going to better focus on a Davos perspective?
So actually, a couple of elements on that, Bob. First of all, I think the whole element of maternal, child, and newborn health includes family planning. It does explicitly. It does under the WHO guidelines. It does under what Canada's done. Canada actually, Margaret and I were both involved in programs putting millions of dollars into family planning in Ethiopia, which is one of the most successful examples of progressive family planning of the 21st century. There is a global lack of emphasis on family planning, where in fact the support for family planning has dropped by half in ODA budgets when health budgets in ODA have quintupled. So there's a challenge there. But actually it fits into this present program. On the issue of improving kind of international governance, one of the key challenges is ensuring that the overwhelming complexity of different actors doesn't lead to kind of constipation of decision making. And the people who are actually looking for better approaches to that are often from the South. So I would expect most of the key innovations in governance, as in so many other things, are actually going to come from the developing the emerging economies. I mean, they're the ones who suffer the most when international governance doesn't address their needs. Right? So I don't know what that new model will look like. I expect that'll be part of what we should talk about. I do not think looking to past will lead us to the future. That would be my point.
So I could just, on that, go from, if I could invoke the the chair's privilege here, but go from international governance to domestic governance. And you talked a lot about integrative leadership and the need for integrative leadership to carry out targeted interventions and strategic shaping and so on. How would you rate Canada in terms of integrated leadership? And I think specifically, and you and I have had this conversation on a couple of occasions in the context of amalgamation of the department, Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, and moving ahead. And it's more, we all know it's more than just DFAT-D. There are a lot of other government departments participating in international activities. But how have we been doing? And as we move forward, if you had one or two pieces of advice on how to become even more integrative, and especially in the context of DFAT-D, how we can do this most successfully, what would that advice be?
I guess one of it would be get out of the government. I mean, you know, a coordinated, integrated perspective. I don't just mean you, although if you want to come. What I mean is, when we look at the challenges of Canada's engagement in the world, why do we always look to what's happening in Ottawa? Like, we've got a country of 35 million people from sea to sea, and we have actors from sea to sea who have a huge impact. So, you know, what is tech doing in terms of its programs and response to mineral development? What impact could that have? What are the different key NGOs doing, and what's the impact they could have? Why is it that all the key, you know, public policy institutions, the think tanks in Canada, are busy competing with one another rather than collaborating with one another, right? I mean, one of the things that strikes me, we actually have in our think tanks across Canada as much spending and weight as Brookings. I don't think we have the collective impact. So this idea of an integrated perspective isn't just what we do here in Ottawa, it's what we do across the country. And so to me, it's what's the 21st century narrative for international or global engagement, right? What are the issues we care about? How do we make a difference? Where do we make a difference? And then how do you actually have a whole of Canada approach? And organizations like this and events like this play a really important role. So then Canada's federal government is one of the multitude of actors that are working in a collaborative approach. I think there's other countries that actually do this much better than we do in terms of the whole of country engagement. Holland does this much better, right? With the private sector, the government, the NGOs are working much more closely together. Arguably, the UK does this better than us. So I think if we're really going to be bold about integrated domestic approach, let's look outside of Ottawa and get all these other actors to align their efforts.
I expected blunt advice, and I got it. Thank you for that. We've got about 5 minutes to go, and I promised I'd bring this in on time. So maybe the best way to do this is take a final 2 or 3 questions together, and then, Robert, back to you for a final summing up. So perhaps we could start over here, please.
Thank you. I'm Thomas Junot from DND, but joining the Graduate School of Public International Affairs as a prof here in a couple of weeks. I'd like to build on Mr. Fowler's question on the issue of Canadian support for global governance reform. As was just said, the global multilateral system was built by 51 states in the 1940s. It's inherently favorable to the West. It's not necessarily zero-sum, but any reform could be perceived as being done not to our benefit, to Canadian benefit. That's a common perception. In your view, is reform of the global multilateral system possible that could benefit Canada? Is there a way to... Canada.
Canada.
Yes.
All right, a couple more before we wrap up. Right here in the third row in the white shirt, please.
Thanks. Good morning, Robert. Daryl Copeland. I'm formerly with DFAID and now teaching and writing and analyzing. My question has to do with the relationship between perception on the one hand and power and influence on the other. Harken back to your report that you did while you were at IDRC on changing perceptions of Canada's image and reputation in the world. And your conclusion there, if I could just try and condense it, was something like the emperor has no clothes and Canada's in danger of falling into a say-do gap because what we were saying and what we were doing seemed to be diminishing our credibility. So that was, I guess, almost 10 years ago, that report. I just got back from a month in Europe teaching and going to conferences, and the overwhelming response that I got when I said, "Hi, Daryl Copeland from Canada," was kind of a prolonged silence and then a, "Do you know, we don't really recognize you guys anymore." So my question is, if we look at brand, if we look at reputation and image of a country, how do these changes in Canada's image and reputation, some of which you've tracked, back into your scenario for opportunities for Canada going forward?
So,
Can I just take one more? Is that go for it, or do you want to go? The question or comment, please. Right over here.
I'm Alison Roby from DFAT Development. I want to bring together two of the things that you mentioned, two areas where Canada could be a leader. One is minerals, and the other is bringing together our domestic actors, such as civil society and the private sector. Do you think there's a role for a positive partnership between the private sector in Canada and civil society organizations internationally to somehow make Canada a very good leader in mineral extraction all over the world in a way that makes it bring development to poor communities and also makes Canada prosperous? I know that's a really tall order, but what do you think of that?
So let me try to weave those three together. I would say, whereas 10 years ago, there was a huge gap between what we were saying and what we're doing. The good news is there's a very clear alignment between what we're saying and what we're doing. Some people like what we're doing more than what others like what we're doing, but we've actually dealt with the historical hypocrisy of Canadian engagement. I think the issue now is, what are we doing, and are we doing the best things? And I think the challenge would be, for those who are saying we don't like what's happening today, so what should we do tomorrow that's better or different? This issue, let's try and learn and adapt. That's got to be our approach globally. So that's the challenge I see now, right? Connecting it to this issue of responsible mineral development, I think that's a very good example, because responsible mineral development is really challenging. When you're dealing with remote communities, when you're dealing with asymmetry of power, when you're dealing with, all sorts of vagaries and opaqueness of leadership structures in those areas, and relationships between corporations and certain individuals. So it's very messy. It's also incredibly necessary. Because if it's possible to have responsible mineral development where companies, when they're doing the advanced exploration, are spending as much time looking above the ground in the community as they're looking below the ground at the ore bodies, if they actually work collaboratively together, if they have transparent public documents and contracts, if they work with the community, it can be so empowering for those countries. And so profitable, and appropriately so, for the corporations who are doing this right. This is a great example of positive sum if it's done properly. Canada has a major role to play there because of the listing of companies on the TSX, because of our Canadian companies who are doing this, and because we have a tremendous wealth of knowledge in both the private sector and in the NGOs, often the very critical NGO communities around this issue. So it's a perfect place where we can actually make a difference, but it's tough, and it takes courage, and it takes commitment, and it takes sustained commitment, which is why I think what's been attempted over the last few years, which is well beyond what we were doing when I was there, I think is actually very positive, but I think it needs to go further. And this links back to the question of, is changing the international governance good for Canada? Because of our unique position geopolitically, we are structurally disinterested. I mean, we can have zero-sum negotiations on a specific trade agreement, but we actually overall benefit from enhanced global trade. We benefit from open, stable, prosperous systems. One of the reasons why we're so disinterested isn't because we have a superior DNA. It's because our vested interests as a nation are embedded in having a more prosperous world. So, you know, if we can engage in things that improve international governance, if we can engage in things that improve mineral development, if we can engage with things that deal with cybersecurity, it's really good for the world, but it's also really good for Canada. And there's this alignment of interests that we have, unlike many of the other BRIC and G7 countries who have such regional challenges to address, that actually allow us to be really, in some ways, very creatively positioned on a number of these issues. So I think if we help enhance governance per se, in a disinterested level, it helps Canada.
I'm going to wrap it up there. It would be wonderful if we could have another hour or two with you, because as usual, you're incredibly stimulating, incredibly provocative, and very, very well informed and eloquent. So thank you so much. I think what you've done, Robert, is you've kicked us off with a huge bang here, and you've put so many interesting issues on the table. As we start to delve into these issues in a little bit more detail over the next couple of days, you've set a nice little context for us, an incredibly complex, challenging world, but Canada has the assets, it has the integrative leadership to actually look for these pivotal interventions and these shaping strategies, and I think that's something that we can keep in mind over the next couple of days. Where are those interventions, and where can we play a difference in terms of shaping those strategies? So thank you very much, and again, wonderful start to the conference in my view.